Joshig, welcome. Welcome to Digital Insights. Monique Manach and Dishnikos, Kidikanik Anishinabek and Dojaba. My name is Monique Manach, and I'm a member of the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. And today we're speaking with Kaija Heitland. Kaija is a Métis artist living on Vancouver Island. So, Kaija, tell us about your art and your life. Tell us about everything.
Bon matin, good morning, Monique. It's so nice to be able to do this interview. Yeah, like you said, my name is Kaija Heitland, and I am a Red River Métis artist. I live on Vancouver Island, and I do the majority of my work here on the traditional lands of the Quotson, the Cowichan tribes. I live in Maple Bay, so just outside of Duncan in North Cowichan region, and I work professionally as a tattooer, and I also run my company Indigenous Nouveau here on the island from home. And I run an online business as an in-person skills communicator, arts communicator within my community. I belong to the Cowichan Valley Métis Nation, which is Cowichan Valley Métis community, which is in Region 1 here on Vancouver Island, one of the chartered Métis communities here.
Tell me about your designs, your tattoo designs. Do you do them yourself, or do people come with ideas? How does that work?
For the first part of my career, that was definitely the way that my career worked. Did a lot of work that people brought in, and I would adapt and customize, and so I've actually been tattooing for 18 years, and I first started on the Sunshine Coast, working in Sechelt, where I actually did go to school. And so I've worked in a number of different tattoo shops over the years, and now both myself and my husband do completely custom work. We're very specialized in the work that we do, so both of us design our own work and have clients come to us. So when it comes to tattooing, I didn't necessarily approach it as an Indigenous artist for the first, I'd say, at least 15 years of tattooing. There was a lot of space in the industry for Indigenous tattoo artists. There weren't a lot of Indigenous tattoo artists, especially Métis artists, um, at least for the first 10 years that I was tattooing. And then there was a real rise in popularity in searching out specifically Indigenous artists to do Indigenous work. The tattoo industry itself is um, pretty guilty of cultural appropriation. And so, there was a real trend towards making sure that people at least went to professional artists, even if they weren't Indigenous, to do professional work. Just because there weren't that many Indigenous artists that had done apprenticeships and worked in professional shops, right? A lot of people were self-taught. Um, and there's a big difference between um, education in indigenous traditional tattooing and being in a tattoo shop, and um, often those two paths to becoming a professional tattooer don't have a lot of overlap. um, so now we're seeing a real trend towards Indigenous tattooers getting a much better education in things like bloodborne pathogens and working in a professional shop and understanding cross-contamination and things like that. So they're doing really beautiful traditionally done tattoos, stick and poke tattoos, um, hand done tattoos, skin stitching, and all of those traditional types of tattooing, but in a much more professional environment, which I think that's where we have this really nice overlap of education kind of flowing in both directions from the traditional, like from the contemporary tattoo industry over to traditional tattooing.
How did you get interested in tattooing? How did you end up in the industry?
I actually got a summer job working in a tattoo shop, and when I was 17, and the tattooers that were working there sometimes were a little bit blasé about their schedules and often behind in their drawings. So I just picked up, as part of my duties, I started doing line drawings. I started doing drawings and making stencils and things like that. And it seemed natural for me to continue that. And I was offered an apprenticeship. I hope due to my work ethic. and, um, and so I was given this amazing opportunity, and I really can't imagine not having been or not having become a tattooer because it's afforded me an incredible amount of um, downtime, flexibility. I don't know how well I would have done being an employee. Yeah, I'm definitely, I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. And, that's one of the things that I think we're going to talk about today is entrepreneurship, Indigenous entrepreneurship. But may I speak a little bit about my background in business?
Please. Yeah,
Excellent. Um, so I started my first business when I was 12 years old. I decided that I wanted to create earrings, little beaded earrings, and copper wire earrings. My parents were building a house, so there was a ton of copper scrap all over the yard. So I was stripping insulation off of copper housing, off of copper wire from for the house for the electrical, and I was making all of these earrings out of this recycled material. My dad went to Lee Valley and bought me little wooden business cards. We went online and bought earring hooks, and my mother lent me $50. Um, she loaned me $50 for the purchase of a table at a craft fair. So they were always very supportive of my entrepreneurial spirit and I paid my loan back to my mother. That loan was without interest, but they still they always gave me a really good basis for how business works and repaying loans and borrowing to make money. And so that gave me the first taste and I started making my beaded earrings. They drove me down to the local bead store where I asked them if they would have my work in the store. And so I sold earrings for a few years at the local, hippie store with all the incense and the beads, and I had an account there. And so every time a piece of jewelry would sell, I'd put it on my account and then buy materials with it, and really understood the value of putting money back into your business at a very early age. And they really encouraged me with that. And ever since then, I've be I was singularly unsuitable for being an employee and having a proper boss.
I know that feeling. I was in my mid 30s, I think, before I started this organization.
Mhm.
Once I got it going, I was thinking, why didn't I do this? I mean, all I got horrible boss stories.
Right.
I I was not suited. That's a good term. I was not suited for that environment.
No, no, I definitely, I've had some bosses over the years, tattooers work in an environment that is either a collective or as a subcontractor. So you have more, shop owners that you work with as a subcontractor, as an independent artist, as an independent business owner within the construct of a tattoo shop. So that flexibility allowed me, that independence allowed me a lot of space to further my education and explore other work outside of tattooing. Um,
What kind of work
and so very thankful for that.
what kind of work did you look into? What kind of
Well,
what
I
yes.
I would I'd actually like to start talking a little bit about Indigenous Nouveau at this point because there's a very natural break in tattooing for me that arose during COVID. Obviously, as we're considered to, you know, as far as contamination and everything is concerned, we're kind of in the health worker um, line of business. So we were unable to tattoo for quite a long time. Being in close proximity to other humans, and as far as communication of COVID was concerned, and so there was a real break for at least 8 months where we were unable to pursue tattooing full time. So I've been beadworking my entire life, working on flat work, two needle stitching my whole life, working with porcupine quills and fur and leather. Um, and it just seems such a natural time for me to actually spend months and months refining my skills. And it occurred to me that it was a terrible business model to solely rely on a one luxury product based business. Um, that we have in the tattoo industry. It's a very unsustainable business model, and we're seeing, now in the economic downturn, actually, that how precarious position tattooers are actually in as far as their income is concerned, as far as financial stability is concerned. And so during COVID, I decided to start this other business, and actually make a bit of a run at creating products that allowed people to access my art without, the really high price tag of large beadwork designs and moccasins and all of these kind of higher price luxury items that and indigenous work that is, out of the price range of a lot of people. So I wanted to create products to actually share with my indigenous community that were a lot more affordable. And so I started creating fabrics. That was really the basis for Indigenous Nouveau. I started creating fabrics, designing fabrics, and having them manufactured in Canada, which is a real tenet of the work that I do, is supporting domestic infrastructure. And none of the products that I create in my entire store are actually made overseas. Everything is made domestically in North America. Actually in the United States and in Canada. And I've been a really strong proponent of that throughout the Indigenous entrepreneurship education that I do, as well as, branding and working with one-on-one with clients for business restructuring, specifically for Indigenous small businesses, and putting a real fine point on Indigenous products that are made on Indigenous land, and wherever possible by Indigenous companies.
I see you do ribbon skirts.
I do. Um, For me, I've absolutely loved ribbon skirts for, well, my whole life. And for I really approached the ribbon skirt as a tool. It is a piece of regalia, and it is a sacred um, symbol for so many people of their indigenous identity and their heritage and their connection to earth. And there, I saw the ribbon skirt as being this great communicator to really start to discuss kinship ties and shared traditions, because it's found ubiquitously across North America in different forms. And so I thought that the ribbon skirt was such a beautiful analog for relationships within the Indigenous community with First Nations and Inuit and Métis people and other Indigenous groups in North America, because of its origins. The combination of a traditional skirt made with European materials, with that influx of ribbon and calico and these beautiful materials being brought over from Europe, through the Hudson's Bay Company and through other trading companies that First Nations people and Métis people were able to gain access to. And you see these traditional sacred skirts that come from the tea dresses and the buckskin dresses and the buckskin skirts of the plains and the woodlands being reimagined in these new world. It does in I mean, it is really a new world design. It was created here in the new world, or the very old world. And it's that, like I said, that skirt is an analog for these two completely disparate cultures coming together in a physical form. Um, and it's pretty amazing that the ribbon skirt has become such a symbol of identity. So through my business Indigenous Nouveau, I decided that it was time to do a little bit more giving back to the community, because I mean, what's a better measure of success but your ability to go back into your community and support others? Um, and so I started the Ribbon Skirt Project initially with a small grant through Métis Nation British Columbia to distribute and create ribbon skirt kits for free to, disenfranchised members of the community, people facing financial challenges that didn't allow them to connect to traditional arts and skills training, people who were geographically isolated from their chartered communities. British Columbia is a huge province, and there's just no way that, chartered communities can actually access and distribute resources to everybody. So doing this online was really helpful for people to apply to the program. And so I tithe 10% of my profits off of my business Indigenous Nouveau that go directly into um, producing ribbon skirt kits that are distributed free of charge now, not only within the Métis community in British Columbia, but also throughout the country. And I've also opened it up to First Nations individuals who are in need of some basic skills training in sewing. And so the ribbon skirt project became a bit more of an educational project on the history of the ribbon skirt and again shared teachings and shared culture, kinship ties, in an effort to start to negate some of the lateral violence surrounding, ownership of regalia and where these, origins come from.
I love that there's so many different styles and a dress as well. You do ribbon dresses.
I do.
They're beautiful.
I love doing ribbon dresses. For years I've made ribbon aprons actually because I feel like, especially in the Métis community, one of our huge cultural touchstones is cooking and feeding your family and coming together over food and shared food culture from all of these really distinct branches of the Métis family. A lot of us have English and Scottish descent or French descent, depending on which region you come from and where your kinship ties lead your lineage. And so food is a pretty amazing part of our community. So making the ribbon apron, bringing a little bit of that sacred into your kitchen, into the way that prepare food for your family and your community. It's just a reminder that ribbon skirt is kind of ever present as a symbol.
I see you also have matching mother-daughter ribbon skirts with the
Yes.
oh, oh, that's so beautiful. Oh
I
man.
love I love making ribbon skirts for young people and children and even babies. They're just the cutest little things.
They're gorgeous. And how did you come up with these designs? I mean, you're a graphic designer as well.
Mhm.
So obviously uh, your creative expression is design is I mean, obviously with all the work you do with doing the earrings, everyone's
Mhm.
different. How do you what's your inspiration for these designs?
Oh, so this is something that I talk a lot about in the talks that I give and the work that I write that's available online. But I really keep my teaching and my work really non-denominational. Um, I talked very briefly about how diverse the Métis community is. And so I really encourage exploration into each individual participant's roots, the regions that they came from, all of the people that they come from. Because when I do the work that I do, not not very much of it is very strictly Red River um, inspired because of where my family came from. My family names are Hodgson, sometimes written as Hudson, Dino, and my Hodgson family originally came from Fort Albany and then migrated to the Red River and weren't in the Red River for a terrible amount of time, but traveled back there, and that's where our kinship ties are, to the Hodgson family, and then they moved into Ontario, and became the Frost. So Frost is another one of my last names, and so your personal artistic line that you come from is based on all of your lineages, and that's something that I really promote as far as identity is concerned, and feeling whole and finding what your identity is and what really belongs to you, as a Métis person, because sometimes can become a little bit difficult, and there's a lot of pan-indigenization within the Métis community because of people being disenfranchised and isolated, and stigma being attached to connecting to your roots. So I really encourage people to do really strong investigations into their own heritage, specifically where their family came from, the regions that they inhabited, the kinship ties that they had with First Nations, that they may have cousins in, that their aunties and their grandmothers came from. And so in my work, my design work, I reflect a lot of the Scandinavian roots from my father's side of the family and from my Sami side of the family, who are indigenous to Finland and Sweden, of course. They're European indigenous people. Um, My name Kaya is a very traditional Sami name. And so I like to reflect that in my work. I talk about how I use the language of beadwork to tell the story of all of my lineages. And it's so important to represent everywhere that my people come from. Um, I talk a lot about doing very stark, simple Scandinavian design work that I grew up with from, the other lineages of my family, and they all so beautifully are translated into beadwork. So I really adapted a style that's a fusion between those two things, and it's incredibly personal to me, and I feel like it tells the story of my family because I'm not just Métis. I happen to also, you know, um, have all of these other beautiful influences, and I really think that that's kind of what makes being Métis special is that we bring all of these other cultures with us from our other lineages, and I try to avoid, tokenizing the indigenous ancestry that I have because it is only one aspect of all of the people that I come from.
Well, I love the beadwork on your purses and your bags. Is that inspired from your lineage, or you spend a lot of time on the land?
I
Do you
do.
find inspiration comes from there as well?
Absolutely. I every time I release a fabric design, a new fabric design, I only release them in the seasons that those flowers, those fish, those berries are being harvested in. So, I for every time I release a new fabric, my Kinnikinnick fabric, I released it as a holiday print, as a winter print. I released my strawberries at the very beginning of summer, that print. I released my salmon print and my trout and my sturgeon in fish harvesting season. I released my blueberries in the middle of summer, and the fireweed when it's blooming at the, late spring, and those things are really relevant. I think that it's important to design and work within the seasons, just like we would harvest and fish and hunt and process in those seasons too. So there's no reason that art can't follow those same seasonal changes. Those are so important to all of the people that I come from. All of the people that I come from are northern, and so in my family we celebrate all the solstices and the equinoxes, and those are super pivotal points for nomadic and harvesting based people, right?
Absolutely. I noticed the fur that you use as well. I am seeing beaver fur, rabbit fur, I think,
Hmm.
and some of it is white. So, for the winter,
Hmm.
it's it's.
Absolutely.
And I love the different styles too. You have more of a pointed toe.
Hmm.
That's more Western, I think. I'm Algonquin, so we have a more
Mm.
like the rounded ones you have. We have more like those. But when you
Yeah,
just
pardon me.
so when you design your moccasins, you know, with the beadwork, and I'm wondering about your correlation between the beadwork and your fabric design.
Mhm.
Um, how how interconnected is that? How when you're is it a different thought process that goes into fabric design than into beadwork?
I think that it is because all of that fabric design comes from a place of graphic design.
Mhm.
And there's a very different there's a very different approach when you're coming from graphic design. Generally, when I'm doing beadwork, I draw directly on the material, on the leather or the felt that I work with. I don't actually create patterns for myself. I do create patterns for other people to follow. And that's something that I provide to the community, but I also sell online packages of beadwork patterns. And but when I'm creating the work that I do, everything is hand drawn. I feel like there's a real authenticity to not having a copy of the work that I do, that it's completely unique. And it actually probably comes a little bit more from tattooing and making things original and bespoke and only created once. So I don't recreate any of my beadwork designs unless it's for a commission and I'm doing a matching set or something like that. I don't create anything in production, unless it's one of the kit designs that I create, that other people are also creating the same design for. But I like to keep those things very separate because the digital work is it's commercial work as much as it is, it has its own autonomy and in conversations about, Indigenous data sovereignty, which also covers, our artistic data. Um, you do have to have a very different approach with it. So it is commercial design. It has to be, in the right file types and designed with repeating patterns to make sure that fabric is is going to be printed properly. And um, yeah, I feel like the beadwork that I do, every piece is very unique, rather than reproduced. So that's, a very different field than the graphic design work that I do.
How did you get into graphic design?
I mean, again, that comes from tattooing. When I started tattooing, everything was drawn by hand. Everything, all the line work was created on tracing paper or onion skin, and incredibly labor intensive. And I tend to think that I was probably a better artist when I was drawing everything by hand. You have a different relationship to drawing on paper, of course, and there's a certain amount of flexibility and refinement that comes from being able to do digital art that we didn't necessarily have before. There was a rusticness to tattooing before the invention of the iPad Pro, where you could draw, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes for a different image altogether. How did you break into the graphic design industry? It's not unless you're working in it, it's kind of it's a bit of a process to start doing logos for different organizations.
Absolutely. I think that it wasn't at the very beginning when I started Indigenous Nouveau, it wasn't necessarily something that I was pursuing at the beginning. It was mainly about beadwork and fabric and, stickers and things like that for my own business. And I started to get approached by other Indigenous businesses that wanted help doing logo designs, sticker designs, that type of thing. Website design, because I also built all my own websites, do my own e-commerce and everything. And so, it's awful to say sometimes, but COVID was actually one of the best things that ever happened to me as far as my business was concerned, because it allowed me to take a break. I'm such a go-getter, and I have a very strong work ethic to the point where it's a little detrimental to my health sometimes. People often ask me how I accomplish so much, and I just tell them that I sleep really well and then just work my butt off during the day, and then I get to sleep at night. Um, but uh, I I decided that I wanted to really educate myself during COVID. And that's what I mean by COVID being one of the better things that's happened to me with my business, because I've been working so hard with my nose to the grindstone in tattooing for 15 years, and I never really popped my head out until then. And it afforded me the luxury of educating myself. So I started taking online courses in e-commerce and website design, and I'd already done quite a bit of graphic design before then, just through the tattoo industry, making my own prints and t-shirts and stickers and business cards and all of that kind of thing. When you own your own business as a tattooer, you have to do all of that work as well. Banners for conventions and things like that. So it was kind of a really natural transition to get into doing that work for other people, especially other Indigenous businesses and other Indigenous entrepreneurs that haven't had the luxury of that time to be able to educate themselves. So, or had opportunities, like even had the access to that type of education. So I decided that that was something that I wanted to do. And then it didn't stop at logo design. It transformed into teaching other businesses about branding, teaching other businesses about their social media presence and how they represent themselves in the world, and how, we needed other corporations and organizations and institutions to take Indigenous artists seriously as professional working artists. And one of the ways that you do that is by being loud and putting yourself out there and applying for these projects. That's what it takes. Half of the graphic work that I've done for a lot of larger organizations has been writing my own proposals and submitting them, really building it, and then they came. So there's a huge amount of, you have to be incredibly self-motivated, but there are channels, there are competitions, there are calls for, large scale arts installations that are available everywhere. And I just encourage people to go out and really do that research, seeing the opportunities that are already available.
When you're teaching businesses about using the internet, using social media, e-commerce, what are some of the things that you encourage them to do?
When I first start working with a business, it's really important for me to assess the fundamentals. So sometimes when I'm working with people, especially when it comes to branding or logo design or anything like that, I just first have a consultation. We just talk about, where they're already at. Some people have started their businesses already and have been working for years and are kind of stuck and feel like they need to, rebrand or re-promote themselves. And some people are starting from scratch, which is a really cool place to start because I really believe in holistic business building. And starting with goals and values are some of the most important parts of establishing your business. When we're talking about holistic business building, um, we're really talking about treating your whole business like an organism, right? We're treating the whole patient. And so if you don't do that work to establish your values and your ethics and your goals right at the beginning, you don't really have a compass when it comes to scalability, when it comes to future decisions that you have to make in your business. But if at the beginning you really focus on those values and you focus on where those values come from, when I'm teaching my holistic business building course, I really encourage people to identify where their values come from, whether that comes from community, whether that comes from family, whether that comes from, learned traditional Indigenous teachings or lived experience, and it's not for me to provide those answers. It's for people to do the investigation and see, what their motivations are, how they measure success, and all of those questions help somebody to build a really strong values base because down the line, even as a beginning business, it's hard to see, when you become very successful, that those decisions become really hard when you have to make a decision about, your profit margins and whether you need to make a decision about continuing to create a product and have that manufactured overseas, instead of domestically, instead of working with a local company to, expand your market or to increase your profit margin because you can have something made more affordably overseas. Um, but then if you go back to your values and one of your tenets and one of your values is supporting local infrastructure or creating truly Indigenous products on Indigenous land, or making sure that none of your project or none of the project products that you're creating, making sure that none of them exploit other Indigenous people around the world. It's really simple questions like that that you build into your values. So down the line, when a company asks you to create a product for them and it's not an ethically created product, even though it's an amazing opportunity for you to get your name out there or work with a big magazine or anything like that, it's a really easy decision for you to make because if it doesn't align with your values, it's always a no. And then you find a workaround. You find out how to do that thing within the bounds of your values and your goals.
What kind of protocols do you find are most important to you in your business?
Well, like I said, definitely supporting Indigenous manufacturing wherever I can. And when I can't do that in North America, I find companies. I often, when I work with other organizations, one of the issues that I run into a lot of the time, when I'm working with bigger companies like Walmart or Home Depot or Canadian Tire, and we're working with a manufacturer, there's not a lot of control that you have over the actual manufacture of that product, the location of manufacture, because there are pre-existing contracts that they have with manufacturers. So, as an Indigenous person going into industries like that or working with winners for them, I worked on a campaign with Winners, especially. I'd like to use that as an example to produce their Every Child Matters shirts and for their campaign in 2023. And I did two different Métis designs of strawberries. And we did in English, Every Child Matters, and then in French, Chaque enfant compte. And it was a stipulation of my contract with them, and I made sure that it was written in that we would not use any t-shirts that were manufactured in China and they were actually manufactured in the States, and that we would use a printing company domestically. So we chose a printer in Montreal to print those t-shirts. And so I just made sure that every time I worked with one of these organizations, I was able to give advice in a consulting capacity when it came to the way that they write contracts to interact with Indigenous individuals, to give us the opportunity to teach um, these large corporations about how to treat Indigenous art like it has its own autonomy, right? And following the protocol and the principles of OCAP and data sovereignty, and getting people to recognize that Indigenous art cannot be owned in that sense. Anything with autonomy cannot be owned. It can be licensed. You can give permission for somebody to print it. But these larger corporations don't own Indigenous art. They can't own something that has its own identity and its own sovereignty because it represents culture. And so I got to work with Winners TJX, and they were amazing about. They ended up putting together a committee that I spoke to. um, I've been really impressed with these large organizations, and dealing with Walmart especially. They were really great about it, about listening to me as far as how I thought the art should be treated, and as far as the manufacturer was concerned. With the Walmart, I made a series of gardening gloves for them, and I still believe some of their locations sell them, and they're also in Canadian Tire and Home Depot. But we worked hand in hand with a factory. Um, Overseas, actually, we worked with a company in Pakistan that was established by a family who had immigrated to Canada and started clothing manufacture here, and then moved back to Pakistan to support their village, and then hired and employed basically everybody in their village, and made sure that they had safety protocols and wage protocols that aligned with Canadian standards, actually. And so that was why we chose that factory. And they were great about allowing me to create a product that still reflected my values. So there's lots of room for you to work with these organizations. If they're really excited to work with you, there's no reason that you can't go in there and tell them that you want to create a value-based product, which I know is a real stalemate for a lot of Indigenous artists, not wanting to go out in the world and have their art on coffee mugs because they know everything's made in China. Like there are ways to do this. It's just a little extra work, and it takes a little bit of grit, but you can get it done.
That's amazing because you hear so many stories about cultural appropriation.
Mhm.
And you hear so many times when artists aren't paid, their work is ripped off. Next thing
Yeah.
they see it somewhere, on T-shirts or what have you. So to know that either these organizations and companies are becoming more educated or
Hmm.
more willing, there's more
Hmm.
political will, I guess, to
Hmm.
work with Indigenous. Um, it's been a long road, so to see that starting to happen is absolutely incredible.
And I think that there's so much more. The Indigenous art industry has been taken so much more seriously, and Indigenous artists, First Nations artists, Inuit artists, Métis artists are really really being taken more seriously as professional artists. Our art is being seen, our handicrafts are being seen as fine art, um, for the first time, um, and that has to do not necessarily with corporations changing their mind about it, or organizations or the industry changing its mind. It's about Indigenous individuals um, teaching others how they need to be treated. And these are decisions, and this is like a grassroots effort that needs to be undertaken by all of us. And I do recognize that not everybody has the resources or the ability to do that. And I am not a gatekeeper in any sense of the word. All I do, I just want to educate on a way to do things. And there's no way that I would ever, manufacture or product shame any other business, especially other small Indigenous entrepreneurs, because it's such a learning curve, and there's so much scalability that I understand that not everybody can afford to make those decisions to create a product, that you do have to charge a consumer a lot more for, to make sure that your profit margins actually do support your family. So, number one, make sure that your business can support your family before you do make, decisions that may sacrifice your bottom line. Like the most important thing is that you're creating art and you're supporting your community, you're supporting your family. And then when you get established enough, you do have the luxury to start making those decisions, but we have to continually, look back at our values for those decisions and decide whether, our values are more important, at any given stage, or whether we're able to be a little bit more flexible, knowing that, if your business does really well, then you're able to make more ethical decisions when it comes to producing Indigenous products, because it takes the effort of the whole industry to be able to do that. We all have to make that change together.
Absolutely. How do you find, especially with your logos and using digital tools, how do you find that impacts the, I mean, digital is so much more ethereal. Like once it's out there kind of thing. So how do you find using digital tool changes how your work is seen or how your work is distributed?
Well, personally, my work, I find that the work that I do is incredibly identifiable. Like the work, like people see my work and they do know that it was something that I had created. And I think that that's just being a professional artist my whole life. I have a very distinct signature across all the work that I do. And in tattooing, especially, like I my actual tattoo work, aside from my Indigenous work, is extremely different than the Indigenous work that I do. And it's almost like I have a little bit of a split personality disorder when it comes to my art. I've got very, very different approaches to that work. And so when I'm looking at my digital work, I think that it's very identifiable. Again, I try to make some of my designs very non-denominational. Like I said, there are very few very Métis specific designs that I do make for the community, and for other members of the Métis community to be able to make Métis specific ribbon skirts and dresses and things like that. But one of the really neat things about digital art is the accessibility. Now, we're talking about accessibility of art. We're talking about people actually being able to afford art, digitizing stuff, or digitizing your work really enables people to access the work that you do. Um, and I really believe in that. A lot of the work that I do too for organizations and Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations, whether that's, a police department putting forward their reconciliation reports, or whether it's an Indigenous organization creating resources for vulnerable members of the community. I do a lot of educational resources. I do a lot of guideline and digital work for resources within community. And art is an incredible communicator. And being able to use digital art to indigenize really corporate spaces, indigenize letterheads, indigenize resource booklets, indigenize, reports, corporate reports or governmental reports. Those things, those are the way that Indigenous people are infiltrating, re-infiltrating all of these really corporatized, industries and spaces. And I think that, they are like roots. And I think that eventually those things will be accepted. Using digital Indigenous art is a great way, to disseminate, our strength and our identity. Um, and I really enjoy doing things like resources, and beautifying and indigenizing those things like reports.
How do you think the advent of AI impacts the digital work?
Digital work definitely is going to impact Indigenous work, just as far as, uh, replication replicating work that isn't necessarily Indigenous. I'm not 100% against AI because I don't think that we're at the point where we can really look at what the effects are going to be on traditional industries at all. But in the digital world, I think that people might have to be a little bit careful. There's an authenticity to the work that Indigenous people do. And I think that it's really important to talk about things like sovereignty, data sovereignty, and autonomy that Indigenous art has because it's a representation of culture. It's a representation of um, of community, and those things are really sacred. We all have to be really, really careful about putting that work out there where it might be misinterpreted or misused. And so I think that using AI doesn't necessarily make Indigenous art non-Indigenous, but it gives the opportunity for non-Indigenous organizations and non-Indigenous folks to be able to use Indigenous art as a tool, and I don't think that it should be used as such. I think Indigenous people do have to be pretty careful about how they use AI. And it can be used for fun, of course. There's so much fun AI out there. Using it as a tool, I use AI as a tool quite a bit. You know, I use an AI manager actually, because there isn't any way that I would get all of my things done unless I had a very succinct schedule, and an AI manager that reminded me to do things like take breaks and have a lunch break and, do my wrap ups and my follow ups at the end of the week and things like that. And so I think that there's room for it to increase productivity and make sure that you're taking your leisure time and all of those types of things. But I think when it comes to the art, we have to be very delicate about the way that it might take away some of the authenticity of what we're doing. But that's for everybody to decide on their own. You know whether your art remains Indigenous. You know whether your art remains authentic. I think that like us as artists, we just have to be very honest about what that is.
Well, that's it. I mean, if your art is out there and then it's fed into some AI and it's redesigned by that AI, what is it then? I mean, artists can do that themselves to see. I know some artists who have used wampum belts and beading and fed the whole thing into an AI algorithm and then had it take freeze frames of what is comes out of that. And it's really interesting to see what the AI made of it. But I think that's more of it's a creative process and it's based on that artist specifically using those tools with their own work. But if if some of these designs taken independently and are fed into the AI machine, um, depending on how that AI has been trained, what I mean, even looking at AI being, um, the algorithms are based on annotations, which are like definitions of words. And when you think about the different definitions and whose definition is being used, take the word settler, for example. It means something different to non-indigenous than it does to indigenous. So, I'm always curious about what artists think about what happens if their work is kind of fed into this machine, and then what is it when it comes out the other end?
I think one of the really interesting things when we're considering AI as an artistic tool, if you're using it as a tool to create new work, um, AI that you feed information into doesn't actually function that differently than your own brain. You know, the human brain and our expression of what's going on in our heads, our artistic expression, is the result of it's the it's the composite of all of the work that we've ever seen. It's all the design work we've ever seen. It's all the art we've created ourselves. It's the work we've seen in museums. It's art that other people have created. The trees outside and the birds that you watch and the flowers that you smell. And so when you're creating a piece, it's the culmination of all of your experiences being put into that thing. And AI just does that on almost inconceivably faster and higher scale than the human brain can at this point, right? So we're basically taking all of the things that we love and putting it into an accelerator. And I don't think that there's anything really nefarious about AI at this point until it, achieves consciousness. Um, but I think that using it as a tool, it does beg some discussion about the ethics of it, of course. But I think using it as a tool isn't isn't as destructive as we necessarily think it is. It's not something that I use for my design work just because I love the design process. I love the idea that I'm spitting out something that's the result of all of my experiences, that's the result of all of my, design education. Um, that's not to say that at some point in my life I'm going to run out of ideas, you know, and I might adopt that. You've, yeah, you said a couple of things, there are some notes there that definitely resonate with me because I wonder if I just took all the photos of all of my beadwork and everything and fed it into an AI, see what would come up with just your own art, if you just took pictures of your own art and your own design work, how a different brain, another brain would interpret the work that you do, and how much of that still belongs to you if you're only feeding in your own work, right? I mean, these are big questions.
Well, you kind of wonder, I mean, when it comes out, is it still, and it depends too, because there's so many different AIs. You can actually like you can create on Chat GPT, you can create your own Chat GPT or whatever, right? Your own,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All of these different bots for different uses.
yeah. So if you base it on your values and uh, what your work is about and
Mhm.
your contacts, that's one thing. But for me, it's when somebody else takes your work and feeds it through an AI, is that still your work?
Oh, yeah, when we're talking about like intellectual property rights and that type of thing. Yes, of course. I feel like those things are definitely abuses of ethics when it comes to appropriating art. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Um, yeah, I don't think that that necessarily has a place. It's so reductionist is the other thing, it removes so much of the emotional experience behind creation. And I think that like using it for inspiration is definitely one thing. Using it as a tool to replace doing creative work is another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think too that uh, when the emotional experience of creating the work, I think that you're right. That's what that can be removed. And then once you've done that, does that mean that that your work is out there now? That it's part of that AI training? Is it, and then when somebody else goes to use it with their work, that your work will actually influence their work?
Mm, you know, I don't know how informed the public actually is about access to data on the internet and how I mean, we kind of talk about AI like it's it's the bad guys in the Matrix. Like this larger overarching artificial consciousness that we're feeding everything into like it's one isolated system. And it's not. AI exists independently, company to company, um, has different um, different resolutions of access to the information that's on the internet, right? Like there's the way that we use AI, it is still completely programmable, right? there is still a level of control where we can choose what to feed into it, or just, let it free range graze on the internet, right? So depends on how you like, it depends on what company you're working with and everything like that. I think that um, there are definitely conversations about like the security of your data when you feed it into AI, and you have to be conscious of the fact that your likeness or your work and those things become they kind of go into the public domain a little bit, and I think that there's going to be a lot of laws about that going forward in the future when we start to see some more of the negative effects of using AI as widely as we are. Um, But like at the moment, I use AI. I do use ChatGPT. I do use some of, the different modules and bots that they have. But I use it for my own work, like when I'm doing guidelines and, if I'm doing a 30-page report for an organization, as an Indigenous contractor or consultant, and I need a summary of that 30-page report, I'm not doing that. I'm not,
No.
or the way that I need to, get suggestions on how I should isolate chapters within a document or something like that. Like AI can identify natural breaks. Um, there's a way that AI can edit in the way that a human can't necessarily, especially when you've written something that's that long and you have, a resource um, with different plans, and it covers a number of different topics. It's very hard for you to separate yourself from the work, so you get an objective lens on the way a document should be edited or formatted, or layout be redone and everything. So I find AI quite useful for that, um, just because of being neurodivergent. Honestly, AI is super useful for people with neurodivergence to be able to operate at a high level continually. So,
Absolutely. I find it very handy for that too when I'm writing something. I can kind of send it away to the AI. But there's a couple of things. Like once we have our stuff up on web pages, then it's out there, and AI can, what do they call that? They skim it, or they can they can access it. And the other thing is, when you mentioned intellectual property, um, there's so many of our ancestral designs that I spoke to. I generally use this example. I spoke to an artist friend of mine who said that when her parents realized that she had an artistic leaning, they said, "Okay, um, uh, she's from out west, and their protocols are a lot more established. I guess we don't have them in my community, but they said, here, this is your clan. This is how we." Um, uh, Draw. This is how we. These are the images that belong to us. When you're creating work, you don't create work from another clan. You use these images, and now you're responsible for it. And it's not an individual copyright thing. It's a, a nation, a national, or a community. Uh,
hmm
it- Different communities can have their own, or different
hmm
clans have their own. So it's not owned by an individual. It's a community uh, guardianship as
hmm
opposed to copyright. And so that's why AI um, can be very good on the one hand, but on the other hand, when you're looking at this, we don't have that. We're not with images. We have the same thing with songs or with dances,
hmm
but we don't necessarily have it with images because we didn't. All our images were put into our clothing and our tools and that kind of thing. We didn't make separate art because we followed the path of the
hmm
basically. So you weren't carrying a, a, a canvas under your
Sure.
under your
Yeah.
not so much,
Yeah.
but
Material arts. Yeah.
exactly. So when you think about when I think about data sovereignty or intellectual property, it's so community based as opposed to being individual based. And how is
hmm
that? AI, you got to wonder if it, unless it has those parameters built in, which often it doesn't, um,
Hmm.
you know, how does that impact how we use it and how we work knowing that, how we release our work knowing that. I mean, there's plenty of art out there that isn't based in ancestral design.
Hmm.
The same artist can create, a plethora of different designs without necessarily using their own community work.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I wonder sometimes how, especially in visual arts, how is that? How do people deal with that? Knowing that it's going out there and that it can be, it's like a child when they leave the nest.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a difficult conversation. There are so many different aspects to that conversation, and most of them have to be had within community. Like I think that protocol and tradition is just it's so varied community to community. Um, and especially, and I would never speak to like First Nations protocol or the way that they approach things because we're quite um we're very and sometimes we're very similar, but on the whole, I would say that First Nations and Métis people are we come from a very different perspective and different culture, and so there's nothing that I would ever speak to specific to First Nations and on their art and their protocol. But that's something that has to happen within community and have discussions about what should be allowed and what should be protected um, from becoming part of public domain, right? I mean, another part of that conversation really is like when we think about traditional arts, and this is something that I talk a lot about in the classes that I teach, especially when I'm teaching quill work or some of the more traditional art, not just beadwork, but I don't think that our ancestors had a real concept of their work lasting as long as it actually has. When we're talking about creating things out of natural materials, when there's, anything from a a house pole to a pair of moccasins. These things were made out of natural materials, and it was always inevitable that they would be returned to the earth. I don't think that any Métis grandmother working in the 1800s had any concept of their work ever being in a museum under glass. I think that they made these things knowing that they would last a generation, or maybe even just for the person that they were created for. I don't think that they really had they had artifacts of their own, they had artifacts from their grandmothers and they learned those traditions and they probably saw pieces that were already antiques in their own time. But if they were making practical items, a pair of moccasins with quill work on them wasn't expected to last past the person who they were made for. And you can resole a pair of moccasins. You can take the beadwork off of a pair of moccasins, the vamps, and create, a pouch or, a, a little embellishment on an epaulet or something like that. But I don't. A lot of these cultural items, I think that they have like an impermanence that we now attach to them that our ancestors might not have. So traditional work, like culturally significant work, exists in a completely different world than it has ever done. And I think that not necessarily the rules have to change, but the context that we understand traditional work in needs to change. Right. And so this is part of that broader conversation. It's like the impermanence of art that's made with traditional materials. Right. And is it meant to be impermanent? Is it meant to be fleeting? Is it meant to, you know, those, you know, the all of those like the totem poles on the beach, are they supposed to go back into the wilderness? Are they supposed to decompose and become back and part of the forest and nourish other trees? And what does that mean for the totem poles that are in the museum or the beadwork or the quill work that's in the museum? Does it, in do we lose sight of the autonomy of that piece and it having a finite lifetime by putting it on display as an educational piece? Do we change, the cultural importance or the meaning of the piece itself because we're preserving it in a way that wasn't intended originally? We can't ask our ancestors about what they thought about the treatment of those pieces, right? So I don't know. I don't know if it's a very complicated discussion that we need to have community to community, right? Like we all have different protocols, and I think that there's room for protocols to shift in a changing world that still reflects respect and tradition.
I think you're right. There's one thing about how these traditions were passed down. So not necessarily that pair of moccasins, but how that moccasin was made, the designs that went on that moccasin, the story that moccasin told. Those traditions were passed down from generation to generation, but we don't have, so much was lost that some of those traditions were lost also. But all we have is that moccasin.
Absolutely. And not just the fact that that moccasin might represent, the skill and the technical ability of that person, or a design that reflects their family that was given to, like a design that was given to them to pass on. But the fact that beadwork in and of itself is a storytelling device, in the absence of the written word, in the absence of literacy and all of those things, storytelling was transmitted through tattoo work, through beadwork, through quill work, through birch bark biting and birch bark designs and pictographs and all of these things. Like they're representative of culture in a way that written word and like dissertation just can't, like there's an inherent autonomy to the story itself, which means that piece has its own autonomy. That piece is a living part of culture. And I don't know, sometimes, like, as much as I am totally in love with so many of these historical pieces that I've had the opportunity to see and dissect and photograph and look at and figure out how to do my own work, I feel like sometimes sometimes we made a decision in favor of education that does take away from the autonomy of some of these pieces. I don't think it's any different than a mummy being in a museum, which I think is incredibly inappropriate to display dead bodies in a museum that were, I don't really think that there is much of a difference between something like, a cultural piece that has autonomy, and preservation and storage is completely different than display for me personally. In a research collection and people having access to it where it's preserved in a way that it can teach, that's completely different than something being on display. But I think it's pretty akin to, a preserved body being on display to the public that does not necessarily belong to that culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah, I saw I saw an exhibit of the Pompeii, um, the preserved bodies. I think, well, they were casts, but still, like, it gave me the creeps. I just thought, what are we doing here? Like, why are we ogling these people in their moment of, you know, death?
But that I think, yeah, there's a real, oh man, we're getting to some deep stuff. There's a real fascination with the way that other cultures, especially in antiquity, viewed their mortality, right? Like that, all of this art expression, um, passing down knowledge, storytelling, all of this stuff as a baseline is kind of all about like humanity's quest for immortality. It really is, right? Like when we're talking about things that are going to outlast our own lifetimes, we're putting stuff into the future. We're thinking about the future. It depends on how far a culture thinks into the future as far as, making a pair of moccasins uh, just for one generation or for the intent of it being in a collection in a museum as a cultural touchstone. Um, I think that all of these things are created for us to outlive our lifetimes. And so when it comes to museums, I think we have a real fascination with how people in the past viewed mortality as well, because I think that that is like, one of our biggest questions as an organism. So we are pretty fascinated with death and the dead. Um, but I don't think that we're always very respectful of how those people would have interpreted us putting them on display, you know? Yeah, there's a gruesome, like a little bit of a morbid fascination with it that like I think that we want to view those things so that we ourselves are a little bit more all right with our mortality. I think that it makes it a little bit more palatable sometimes to witness, other people having gone through it,
Hmm. And
right?
now with everything digitized and on the internet, I mean, it's there.
Hmm.
I'm the generation.
Absolutely.
I think I was in my early 30s the first time I got a workshop on how to do email. And I thought, what is this? No one's going to use
Yeah.
email. And, uh, and yeah, now look at us. But, my son, I remember him sitting by the computer and having his little hand on the mouse, and the mouse was bigger than his hand, you know, and it was in his environment all
Hmm.
his all his whole life. It's just been part of his environment. But for me, I have to adapt. You know,
For sure.
I don't think like that because I wasn't raised. I mean, we had a black and white TV when I was growing up. That was a big deal, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, but now with everything out there, and it's always out there. Like
Hmm.
it will always be out there now. This will always be out there now.
Yeah, and just as communities, as individual communities, we have to talk about what protocol needs to be adapted in a changing world. Because older protocol didn't take a lot of future inventions into consideration, like the Second Amendment, things like that, like there are some, there are some really big things that is rules that and protocol that we still run the world with that don't necessarily make sense in the time that we live in. And I mean, actually, like, to use mummies as another analogy for that, they don't cut open mummy wrappings anymore. They do CT scans so that they don't have to unwrap bodies that are meant to be encased in their traditional wrappings out of respect for traditional ancient Egyptian culture, and they consult with, you know, modern Egyptian um, prominence to make decisions like that. So in museums, they don't cut open mummy wrappings. They do a CT scan. They have a full three-dimensional image of it. And that's a way in which, scientific community is adapted to respect traditional protocols, right? We just have to be very firm about what those protocols are. And like each community has to have these conversations about what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable in a changing world.
What do you think about your own work being out there for time immemorial?
Time immemorial. Um, I don't necessarily think that that exists. I think, while our species still really enjoys this planet, and takes care of it into the future, I like to think that the work that I do just continually inspires other people to look back on tradition and see how it can enrich their life. I hope that the work that I do inspires other Métis artists to do really deep dive investigations into where they come from, not necessarily, you know, things and traditions and language and everything that, belongs to the community at large. Because again, we want to move a little bit farther away from pan-indigenization. The reason that I don't do super traditional work all the time is because I kind of rile against that pan-indigenization within our community. Like, I think it's really important for people to identify really where they come from and find inspiration from that. That has an authenticity, to me, that's really important when I go out into the community, and I am very non-denominational in my teachings. I don't do a lot of traditional teaching in the beadwork that I do, number one, because all of the beadwork techniques that we have as an Indigenous community were given to us by non-Indigenous people. Like, while a design can be very traditional and it has originally been adapted from the quill work, it's originally been adapted from birch bark, folding and basket weaving and all of these things. So those traditional designs can be authentically indigenous. The work can be authentically indigenous. The techniques themselves are European techniques that, European and Indian and Chinese techniques, the same two needle beadwork that we do, India has been doing for, 4,000 years. There's nothing indigenous about two needle beadwork in our sense of cultural stewardship. It's something that we've adopted, and we have to be really conscious of that. So I really try to stray away from really traditional teachings when it comes to that, because there's so many lines that can be crossed there that don't necessarily apply to each individual in the community or each individual in my class. Because I really want to encourage people, instead of adopting a teaching, to do the investigation on whether that teaching applies to them or not, right? Like that, and authenticity is the most important thing to me. So going forward into the future, that's what I hope is people look at my work and see that I made a real effort to be as authentic as I possibly could, even if it doesn't look particularly traditional all the time and it's really contemporary. That is my authentic expression of the people that I come from on all sides of my family.
Well, you're giving them the tools to
Yeah.
be able to look into their own culture
Mhm.
and express their own, which is, I think, much better than trying to offer them teachings and continuing that yeah, pan Indian. I don't know what to call it. Um, they're not teachings. They're
There, no, yeah.
better,
And
really.
we're just people to make their best efforts instead of deciding what's easy. Like it, and I try not to be too critical of people who do not have access to these resources or don't have access to community or don't have access to, their family records and they can't do those investigations. All you can do is your absolute best. All you can do is your best. I like to remind people that, your best is one thing, but everything you do as an Indigenous person, everything that you do as a cultural person or a person who is pursuing culture, is you have to be authentic because your ancestors are watching. And like that is like the one rule that you kind of just have to remember is like you can make any decision you want about how you represent yourself as an Indigenous person. Um, but your ancestors are watching. So I always think about myself being judged by all of my different ancestors, and I'm pretty sure that they would be okay with the type of fusion that I'm doing because I'm trying to represent all of them authentically without claiming something over another part of myself, right? Proportional representation.
That's amazing. Well, thank you. Kachimi Gwich. I wish we had way more time to get deeper into some of these conversations. It took a turn. That's amazing. I love it. Oh, that's fantastic. So thank
Yeah,
you.
Masi, thank you so much, Monique. This has been a lovely chat on a beautiful morning.
Thank you. Kachimi Gwich.